Hi y'all, my name is Miss Sue. I'm from McDonough, Georgia, and I am putting together some videos for you to help you with understanding about plants and nature. The series is going to include information on pollination and pollinators, plants, some basics about plants and seeds and growing things. And then also, because I'm a beekeeper, I'm going to try and take you inside the hive and talk about the importance of bees and other pollinators that we have. Does anybody know out there what pollination is?
Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains found on the anther to the center of the flower, which is the stigma. When this occurs, seeds are formed. Some things, like our apple tree here, will form fruit, and inside the fruit will be seeds. We don't think about a pine tree producing fruit, but they do also. It's just in the shape of a pine cone. It's something we might not eat, but a squirrel would, and inside there are seeds. Just like from our apple. Seeds will ensure that a plant will grow for future generations. So each time you see a seed fall to the ground, you might have a new plant coming up.
Most flowers need help with pollination. There's over 180,000 plant species that need help being pollinated. Over 1,200 crops that have to be pollinated by animals and insects. Think about what you like to eat. Now, what I want you to think about is not some packaged food like fruit snacks or a fruit roll-up. Think about whole foods that you like to eat. Do you like eating bananas or blueberries or strawberries? What about almonds? Does anybody out there drink almond milk or just like the nuts? All of these foods we would not have if it wasn't for pollinators. So think about some of your favorite whole foods that you eat that would be gone if we did not have pollination. Pollinators come in all different sizes. You have different kinds of bees, like I said, like a honeybee or a bumblebee. And I wish you could see right now, because I do have a pollinator on my hand. Let me see if I can get him. See that right there? I don't know if y'all could see that. There it is. There is a little fly, and it's a little sweat bee, and actually it's got pollen in its pollen pockets on its legs. I wonder if y'all can see this. Okay, look closely. Do you see? Isn't this neat? Look at that. This little teeny tiny sweat bee is involved in pollination. And if you see on its legs, they're full. We call those pollen pockets. Isn't that neat? I'm just sitting out here, and a perfect example about pollination comes into play. Now bees, they use pollen as a protein, and it's like baby food. So like our example of our little tiny bee, it had been visiting flowers. And when it does that, the center of the flower, the bees really like if it's bright and yellow, because that's the pollen sitting on the end of the male part, or the anther. And when it goes from flower to flower, it moves the pollen around. Sometimes it'll stick to a bee's legs, and they'll push it into the little pockets. Some native bees, like certain native bumblebees, or a mason bee, they don't have pollen pockets, but they do. The pollen sticks to the fur that they have, or the tiny hairs that are on them. And when they go back to their hive, they're able to rub that off. I'm walking away, and this little bee just doesn't want to leave. It flies away, and then it lands back down on me. Taking time out in nature is just really important. Even if it's just sitting in your backyard, you can see so much going on. Just like this little tiny bee. And see, you can still see all that pollen in his little pockets. Here's some examples of flowers right now in my garden, right where I'm sitting. If you notice, the bright red color is very attractive to different kinds of insects. And then it has that bright yellow center. Okay, there, right next to it is a little flower. I'm trying to get my shadow out of here. And there's actually one of our little bees, just like the one. Look at that. Look at that right there. Trying to get, it's working that flower. Okay. And as it moves around, it moves the pollen, and then the pollen will slide down a tube called a stigma and nestle into the center of the flower, or the female parts, and that's where the seeds are produced. So, and after this flower is done blooming, it'll dry up, and then seeds will be made, and then those seeds spread, and then we get new flowers and our new plants. Right here in Georgia, it's the yellow pollen season. As you can see on our trash can here, this is not dirt, this is pollen. Okay, a lot of you might be suffering from allergies. This isn't the pollen you're suffering from. A lot of this is from pine pollen. Pine pollen is not the pollen that's causing your allergies. It's really causing a mess on all of our cars and on our driveways and sidewalks and porches. But it lets us know that the trees are blooming, and it ensures through pollination, not by insects, but by wind and rain, that the trees will continue to grow and propagate. Certain trees are very important for bees and other pollinators, especially the red maple. It's one of the first ones to bloom. We just finished our red maples blooming here in Georgia. You can look on the ground and find seeds all over. Okay, right here, I told you we had our red maple. This is from our maple trees. So from January, when the blooms started, to now, which is almost the end of March, we have seeds. What's interesting about a red maple, besides being one of the first sources of food for bees, there's a male flower on one tree, and another tree has female flowers. So like what we talked about earlier on some of the flowers I showed you, the male flower and the female parts are all together. But on a maple tree, they're separate. That happens a lot in nature. Sometimes when you're growing fruits, you have to have a male plant and a female plant. Here's another example from pollination that is important. Who out there likes strawberries? These strawberries are already blooming. And I know at our local farm that sells strawberries, they have lots of strawberries blooming too. So the bees are very happy. But look what happens. Because it pollinated, we get fruit. If there is no pollination from pollinators like little bees, or even the little tiny bee that landed on my hand, we wouldn't have fruit. Here's another example of what happens when you get pollination. This is our pear tree. And if you can see those little balls, those are new pears that are starting. We had flowers, most of the flowers are gone. And right here is one that was, its petals have dried up. You can see the centers there. Bees were on this tree pollinating, going from flower to flower, getting nectar, and not necessarily planning on pollinating. The pollen sticks to them, like I said, to the tiny hairs on them. And so when they go from flower to flower getting nectar, it ends up transferring, so we have fruit. Sometimes on the flower you can't see the flower parts because of the way the flower is made. Here are some blueberry flowers. Some of these have already been pollinated, and look what we've got growing already. We've got little baby blueberries. It takes a special kind of insect to pollinate these. They need, because the opening is so small, it's hard for certain insects to get in there. A big bumblebee would not come here and pollinate on my blueberry bush. A honeybee would, or also the native blueberry bumblebee. It's a small version of its big cousin. Here's one of the bees working the flowers. Not only is it getting nectar, it's helping to move the pollen around. Let's see if we can see the different parts of the flower. We have its pretty pink and white petals that surround this center cluster. Can you tell the different parts? These little strands right here on the side that have the little
kind of tan nubs on them, that's the male part. That's called a filament, and then the tip of it, the brown part, is the anther, and the anther holds the pollen. We want the bees and other pollinators to rub up against that so they can put it into this center tube. Let's let it get back in focus there. Into this tube right there. It has a tiny hole in it. And when those little tiny pollen particles fall into that tube and go down to the part we can't tell, it's here in the center, called the ovary, that causes fertilization. And in return, guess what we get? We get apples. Just like we saw with our baby pears starting. Pale flowers, and I know it's a bumblebee and not a carpenter bee because his bottom is fuzzy and not shiny. Carpenter bees have shiny little bottoms, the abdomen, the black part. There are many different kinds of pollinators. I just wanted to go over a few of them. Of course, we have our honeybees or our bumblebees. And there's also the little tiny bees, like the one I had land on my hand. That was cool. There are also moths and butterflies. I'm just starting here to see butterflies. We'll be seeing a lot more. Also beetles, ants, and some other insects. If they just cross over that flower and move those pollen grains, they're a pollinator. Sometimes small animals like squirrels or chipmunks, or even a dog goes and rubs up against some flowers. As long as they're moving the pollen grains, that's a pollinator. We also have wind and rain, like I mentioned with the trees. There's wasps. I don't like wasps, but they do an important job in pollinating too. It's kind of like yellow jackets. I don't like yellow jackets. They sting me and it really hurts. But sometimes going from flower to flower, they're collecting pollen and nectar also. Birds are important pollinators too. The hummingbird is one of the most important pollinators of certain kinds of flowers. They like long, skinny flowers that where a bee might not be able to stick its tiny tongue down, a hummingbird has a long, skinny beak and a long, skinny tongue that it can reach into there and help pollinate that flower. So you saw how easy it was to find things that need to be pollinated, flowers, trees. Just go outside. I want you to walk around and see what's in your yard. You might see things like dandelions or clover growing. Some people think those are weeds. Well, a weed is just a plant growing somewhere that you don't want it to grow. Actually, dandelions are very important. We don't ever want to spray them with chemicals because the honeybee loves dandelions. It provides one of the best sources of protein. And remember, protein comes from what? Pollen. So if we kill our weeds or our dandelions, a lot of bees are going to miss out on some important nutrition. Just like you, if you don't eat the right foods, you don't get the right nutrition. I'm going to provide some different links for you to try and do some activities, or if you're nearby, stop by and you can pick up a little packet. And if you keep 6 feet away from me, I might show you some of my flowers too.